The Azerbaijanis became enraged to lose the region they held for some 70 years and started taking their hatred and anger out on the Armenian population of Azerbaijan. The government began the propaganda of a hatred to ignite the everyday citizens against their neighbors. Not everybody, but many. First it was the city of Sumgait, then Kirovabad, then Baku. Thugs stormed our streets and attacked us for simply being Armenian. My school was constantly raided, the rioters looking for Armenian students. We often saw the windows crashing and hid under the tables. Armenian families were spread out across Baku as was planned in the 1970s, when the Armenian neighborhoods were dismantled and Armenians were moved to be separated from each other. That's why when I hear some people mention, why didn't you defend each other? That's because we didn't have anybody to defend us. My neighborhood, Ahundava Street, was in the center of violent demonstrations, and we were living in the dark with windows shut, waiting out a storm. My father always sat with knives in his hands or at the table. And he always said, if they break in, I'm going to take a few of them with me. We were reliving my grandfather's nightmare 70 years later. Not only was I confused as a child, as a 10-year-old child, why this is happening to us. What did we do to deserve such horrific treatment? But my parents were as well. Adults couldn't understand how this could be happening in the Soviet Union in the 20th century. My grandmother, a very wise Russian woman, a teacher, told me to start keeping a diary because things like this don't happen every day, and you must never forget. The diary became my book. My parents started looking at options, even though my mother was in denial that Sumgait and Kirovabad would happen in Baku, a multicultural, intellectual city. Russia was not an option. You couldn't simply move to Russia. You had to find a place to live. Armenia was not an option because it was also difficult to find a place to live after the 1988 earthquake. For almost 2 years, we were in a state of fear and shock in Baku, hoping for things to calm down. Sometimes the Soviet forces arrived during the unrest, the tanks, around my street. But they were only there to make sure Azerbaijanis didn't want to demand independence from the Soviet Union as well. Moscow was in control. They weren't there to protect us. Sometimes my parents, even my grandmother, would go across the street to the tanks and give them food, hoping that the Russian soldiers would protect us would something happen to us. And they said that they had strict orders not to interfere. We never knew when we could be attacked, when riots against us would resume. It was always up and down, peaceful and then not so much. When thousands of Armenians died in the 1988 earthquake, then there were many Azerbaijanis celebrating, and there were many Armenian families receiving cards of congratulations that Armenians were dead. This wasn't just a physical attack, it was a mental attack against the Armenian population of Azerbaijan, to have them be terrified. Going to school became terrifying. My face, Armenian face, and my name was terrifying. My father told me to keep my head low when walking down the street. And if I wasn't asked for my nationality, I was told to say that I was Greek. Even now, as a grown adult, an American citizen living in safety, when I first came across Azerbaijani speech at an event in Washington, D.C., without even thinking about it, my instant reaction was to hide my face, which stunned my husband, who's never seen me like that. And that is what started my activism life, that moment when I felt unsafe in my own country. Any security and stability we had in Baku disappeared. I witnessed violence and intolerance toward innocent Armenians with my own eyes and with my own body, a body of a child. threatened by Azerbaijani neighbor. This was not our home. This is not our home. This was a place we had to flee like hundreds of thousands of other Armenian citizens of Baku and other areas of Azerbaijan who lived there for generations. Some left bruised, beaten, with nothing in the middle of the night in their nightgowns, boarding ships to nowhere. Others leaving hurriedly to distant places away from everything they knew and everyone they loved. We didn't just lose our belongings, our homes, monetary things, material things. Some of us lost our lives. The graves of my grandparents, Yegish's grave, is not there anymore because it was demolished like all the Armenian cemeteries of Azerbaijan. The Armenian church in the center of Baku, the church I treasured visiting as a child, was set ablaze. I've witnessed violence and intolerance, and many of us couldn't take it. 300,000 of us fled. The only place that we could go was Armenia. We had relatives there. Armenia was a magical place I often heard about during my childhood, a place I've never been, a place where my family described in stories of beautiful churches and mountains and music and delicious fruit and very kind people. One of the very first places we visited was Holy Echmenti. We were comforted by the spiritual experience and the presence. But Armenia was far from an ideal place with its recent problems. The 1988 earthquake that I mentioned created floods of hundreds of thousands of refugees because 3 major cities were demolished. Blockade from all directions cut off Armenia from fuel and so many provisions needed for everyday lives. While everyone suffered, Baku Armenians and the earthquake victims were in the worst shape. Many of our Baku family and friends lived in theaters, old prisons, abandoned buildings, and empty factories. Many Baku Armenians were also not wanted there. We didn't speak Armenian. We were blamed for a lot of the problems, in Yerevan especially. My family and I were lucky. We lived in a tiny, cold stone cellar of a distant relative's house and made it our home for 2.5 years. It had no running water, no heat, nothing. The floors were rotting and we had nowhere to go, but at least we had relatives. The changes that were enveloping the entire Soviet Union, not just Karabakh, not just Armenia or Azerbaijan, the entire Soviet Union, the changes were colossal. Life in the rotting basement we called home in Yerevan was unbearable and almost subhuman. And the light at the end of the dark tunnel, 3 years, was United States of America, which was the only country that accepted us as refugees. Now, 22 years later, the entire experience, along with the wisdom and the strength I've gained from it, makes a lot of sense. My family and I encompass the entire trajectory of a glimpse, of a 100-year glimpse of history of my people. Our long, painful paths paint just how united we really are, but we don't know it. In the course of my family's 100-year history, the Sunni Armenians of Zangezur, of my grandfather's line, become Baku Armenians. And then the Baku Armenians are now the Western Armenians, the diaspora.